Hello and welcome, everyone. It's 11 a.m. here in London. We are waiting for a few more people to join us, so we will begin in a couple of minutes. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining. My name is Maria Sofia Reiser. I am a research analyst at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies. Thank you for joining, and it's my pleasure to be sharing this discussion today. Before we start, I wanted to go over some technical points. So for the whole webinar, we will be recording our discussions as well as the Q&A section. So if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to use our Q&A box, write up your questions there. And if you want to put your question up, you can use the vote up function. Please make sure to include your name and organization, any organization you're affiliated with when you ask a question. So about us in the CFCS. For those of you who do not know us or are not that familiar with what we do, we are a specialist research program. We work in the intersection of finance and security. So we aim to carry out research to equip the international community with all the knowledge, tools, and any ideas needed to understand, identify, but also disrupt the threats of illicit finance. This year, we have been working on the Restricting Kleptocracy project, which has been funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. The focus on the project is on strengthening monitoring accountability in what we call the first mile, before funds enter the international financial system. This is done through the important work carried out by investigative journalists and civil society. Our focus regions for the project have been East Africa and Latin America. And in fact, we will be having a similar event on Thursday, the 10th of this month, which will be fully in Spanish to discuss the Latin American experience. So for this project, last year, we held 2 different workshops in each of these regions with members of the media and civil society community focused on domestic and international standards related to combating illicit finance. These workshops covered how building international connections is crucial to advance investigative journalists and civil society's ability to challenge this illicit financial activity, and how this can contribute much more effectively to the wider anti-kleptocracy movement. So today's discussion will therefore be considering how empowering these non-governmental actors is key to the global efforts to reverse this impunity that we see often in those who profit from corruption and kleptocracy. And this way, we can address challenges before these illicit funds disappear into the global financial system. To discuss these critical issues, I am delighted to be joined by a panel of experts that has vast experience investigating corruption, as well as advocating for increased transparency and accountability in the region. Joining me today are John Githongo, an expert investigative journalist, Sheila Masinde, the director at Transparency International Kenya, and John Alan Namu, also an investigative journalist working on Africa Uncensored. Today, we would really welcome all your thoughts, any comments or questions you may have as participants in the webinar. So please.
Our apologies, there seems to be some slight tech issue on Maria Sophia's side. She'll be back with you shortly.
John, if we can go ahead and jump in, and if you can go ahead and just introduce yourself, and we can go ahead and get started with you while Maria Sophia rejoins us. You are on mute, I believe.
Hi, my name is John Githongo from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Inuka Kenya and publisher of The Elephant. I've been involved in anti-corruption work for 25 years.
That's great. Thank you so much. And then Sheila, if you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself in the meantime as well. I believe you're on mute.
Thanks. Thanks, Olivia. My name is Sheila Masinde. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Kenya, which has been working on anti-corruption since 1999, and happy to share the panel with our founder director, John Githongo, and really looking forward to this discussion this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, or whatever time it is in your particular zone. Thank you.
And then last but not least, over to you, John Allen.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Alan Namu. I'm an investigative reporter, the co-founder of Africa Uncensored. I've been a journalist for now going on to 17 years. We focus a lot on public interest journalism around kleptocracy, illicit finance, and various other issues related to corruption. I'm glad to be here. Hopefully what I have to say this afternoon will be helpful, and glad to share the panel with two very eminent Kenyans. Thanks.
All right, I see that Maria Sophia is back with us today. Maria Sophia, while you're gone, everyone has introduced themselves. I will hand it right back over to you.
Thank you so much. Apologies, had some technical issues with the Zoom, but with that and everything said, I would like to welcome John to start today's panel.
Thank you very much. I'll just jump right into it and make just 5 points for us to discuss that are based on observations, research, and work that me and colleagues have been doing over the past, especially the past 5-6 years, since 2015 in particular. And I'll put them out there as statements that we can agree, disagree, and discuss. Number one, in 2014, Professor Larry Diamond, who's a renowned scholar of democracy, said that, you know, when looking at the state of democracy across the world, we were in a democratic recession. And not many have argued with that when one looks at the quality of democracy as it has unfolded since then. I'd like to argue that, especially over the last 2 years, we've seen what was a democratic recession slip into a democratic depression across the world. And you know, there are a number of characteristics that sort of demonstrate that. We've seen a number of countries that don't subscribe to the basic principles of democracy become increasingly forceful and in projecting both their soft and hard power. Talk about Russia, talk about China, talking about the a range of very wealthy countries in the Middle East and a range of other countries around the world are a lot more assertive on the global stage, where they're talking about the UN at the regional level and at the bilateral level, far more effective, far more sophisticated, far more impactful. We've seen conflicts even in Europe, where countries like Turkey have had a very major impact, in Ethiopia next door. So this is a reality that we are facing. Secondly, the other important issue is that we have become much better, people like John Allen, I'm experts at this, in uncovering the granularity of corruption and kleptocracy. We've had these major data dumps, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, and all the others that have been put into the public domain. And one begins to wonder, how does one deal, especially with the younger generation, and a sense of numbness to this, that this information and this corruption amongst leaders is so overwhelming. When we had the first big data dump, which was WikiLeaks around 2011, it helped to propel what we saw, in the Middle East, that was called the Arab Spring later. But now one feels that there's a sense of numbness that has kicked in. How do we move out of that state? And finally, for me, as somebody who's been involved in anti-corruption for a long time, after 25 years, we look at the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index from 1996 until today. The countries that occupy the bottom 30% of the Corruption Perception Index have remained more or less the same, except that we've added more countries as new countries have been formed, or states have failed. So we have new countries like South Sudan, etc., or countries where we didn't have the data in 1996 have now been added. But the countries that were near the bottom in 1996 have remained there. So the question we ask ourselves is, how come? How has our approach failed after 25 years? I think this is a sincere question to ask ourselves. Number two, we have countries that have major corruption and kleptocracy problems in the way they manage their affairs, that have at the same time been able to lift huge sections of their population out of poverty. So you'll find that the current president in China came to power in 2012 on an anti-corruption ticket. Major corruption, especially near the top of the Communist Party, second level, and he's had major efforts against it. It's still a major problem in the provinces. Yet this particular country has been able to deliver huge public goods in terms of health, education, infrastructure to the majority of its people. Whereas in other parts of the world, this hasn't happened. I think this is a conundrum that we are going to have to crack. The same thing is happening in Vietnam and a number of other Asian countries where we have this high corruption, high growth, people being lifted out of poverty despite the corruption problem. Finally, just to break down a bit further, in the early 1990s, when Transparency International was being formed, and then the World Bank and IMF took it on and it became part of the development agenda, one of our philosophies, one of the key pillars was that leadership was key to fight corruption. You had to build institutions to fight corruption. To build the right institutions, you had to have the right legislation in place to fight corruption. The private sector was important. Media and civil society were absolutely integral, etc. We're beginning to ask ourselves, has this top-down approach failed us? Or have we failed anti-corruption? In that we've over-focused on what I would say, for lack of a better word, the very sexy corruption of the big politicians that captures the headlines and all that. Whereas in actual fact, the most damaging corruption in a society takes place at the bottom. It affects disproportionately women and the least educated in society. And in scale, it is far vaster than anything that is, than the billions that we read about that oligarchs are moving around to London and other places. A study by the World Economic Forum and by a colleague, Professor Bo Rothstein, very, very interesting. Italy has had the same legal and institutional infrastructure for the past 150 years. Yet, when corruption is studied in that country, corruption levels in northern Italy are almost at Scandinavian levels, very low. In southern Italy, same institutions, same leadership, everything. The corruption levels are there with Zambia and everything. So we have to ask ourselves whether our approach of perhaps we've overinvested in institutions and not enough in what is called the standard operating procedures in a society and the culture that affects the way people behave towards the relationships. Because corruption, we've allowed it to be dominated by economists. And economists believe that with the right incentive structure, you can change people's behavior. That has failed. We've tried everything. The incentives, the economists have flopped on that one. In actual fact, corruption is a relationship. Corruption is not carried out, first of all, for the poor. Most corruption arrives to them as extortion. They have to pay. They have to pay to be able to get simple services that are owed to them. But I always use the example of a pregnant woman who needs to go to a public hospital to get a scan. She needs that scan. She's asked for $2 for that scan. Are you going to describe when she pays that $2? We describe it as corruption. I'm not very sure. She's a victim of extortion. And so I think that for me, I think we've reached a point after 25 years of basically turning what the fight against corruption in the world means on its head. I think we've worked hard in 25 years. We have not been successful. We've got to rethink our entire approach. And I think now is a good time, as good a time as any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. You've really set up a whole global landscape of how corruption not only impacts countries so vastly at such a higher political level, but in everyday lives. So you speak about this whole impact of corruption and have we failed in the top-down approach. So I wanted to ask you, what does it all mean for anti-corruption, civil society and journalists? And as you mentioned, the TI Corruption Index, and in a great lead on to our next panelist, what does this mean for civil society in this last 25 years of increased movement of it in fighting these levels of corruption in perhaps a different approach than this top-down that you mentioned has failed us?
Sorry, I was hoping my colleagues would answer the question. But one of the approaches that that is under sort of discussion, as I said, that comes out of reflections of Scandinavia, because we've asked ourselves, how come the Scandinavian, Finland, Sweden, etc., Norway, despite Norway having so much oil, how come these countries have got such low levels of corruption, even less than the Britons and the Frances? How come? A bit of study into that again. One comes to the conclusion, which is quite interesting, that at the very bottom of their society, they have let's call them, Professor Rothstein calls them standard operating procedures of how people relate with one another. That in a place like Sweden comes out of the 18th, 19th century, the changes that took place in the church there. And I'm not talking about faith, I'm not talking about religion in that way, but just in the way the churches were organized financially. How do you pay the priest? How does a church find resources for for orphans, for widows. And they had a system where there would be a church warden who was elected by the little village. And that could be anybody. It didn't have to be somebody who was approved by the Lord or whoever was a big person in that particular part of the country. So normal person. And this set up a system, a high integrity system on which other far more complicated things could be done in society, especially in times of challenge, especially when Sweden went to war with Russia and lost Finland to Russia. And talking about a country like ours here in Kenya, and this also applies to neighboring countries, we see similar standard operating procedures. We have a major problem of high level corruption within government, especially public procurement, etc. But ordinary Kenyans, Tanzanians, Ugandans, etc., are able to mobilize for things that are culturally very important: funerals, weddings, the illness of relatives. People are able to mobilize resources rapidly. The level of accountability is extremely high, and the level of integrity with which the whole process is managed is extremely high. And one would almost wonder, are these the same people who are sitting at the bottom of the corruption perception index? And so it's moving to a completely new way of thinking and picking from within society those areas where people do behave and interact with integrity, and seeing how that can be scaled up, for lack of a better way of putting it. But starting at the bottom. I'm not saying you give up on the top, but starting at the bottom. It always strikes me, when you talk about places like China, Vietnam, etc., where they've been able to achieve such great things for the poor. This, I'm not saying it's all sort of smelling of roses. It's got its difficulty, but just it's got its difficulties. But in your countries where a lockdown can be ordered and no one moves, there's no one moving at all, you can't pay a policeman here and there to be able to get around. So there's clearly a sense in which the most egregious, damaging forms of corruption have been lifted off. The petty, what we consider petty corruption, which is what affects the poor the most, has been to an extent lifted off the backs of the poorest and the most marginalized in society. That they can wake up in the morning, go walking, they may be harassed for what they say, but they wouldn't be forced to pay for the most basic in government services. Perhaps we need to focus on that as much as we do in prosecuting our corrupt ministers and presidents, etc.
Thank you so much, John. I think you are right in talking about this interrelationship situation within societies themselves and how this can be so different. I think also culturally, in different contexts. And as you also mentioned, if your colleagues could help answer this question, I hope we keep this discussion going in the importance of civil society joining in. Apologies that I'm having a bit of internet connection, so if you see me freeze, I'm still here. I wanted to, with that, pass on the discussion to make most of the time to Sheila to introduce her comments, and if Sheila, if you want to add anything to what John mentioned, please do. And with that, I pass the floor to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Maria, and thanks, John, for the perspectives. I think I agree with what John has said, particularly in terms of where our focus should be. I mean, I've held that for a long time. It's time now to start, building a behavior change model, which focuses on behavior change at all levels, starting from the individual level to even the institutional level, because I think with together with values, education on values, because for me, that's what's missing. I mean, we'll continue to build our institutions, we'll continue to develop laws, but which we have done tremendously in the last over 10 years. Or even longer than that, when you look at when we really started focusing on the development of anti-corruption laws. But even so, it's not really helping much in terms of pushing the needle in terms of anti-corruption efforts. So I think it's time that we really look at other areas of focus. And for me, it lies in terms of behavior change and socialization, how we socializing individuals from a younger age. And even for us, where we're not in the youth bracket anymore, I don't think all is lost. I think there's still some aspect of behavior change that we can still be able to implement. But it's something I agree with John's sentiments without really repeating what he has said. In terms of my own comments on this issue, maybe allow me first to just reflect on some of the experiences from our own work as Transparency International Kenya, because for some years now we have tried to implement some interventions, particularly focusing on the issues around money laundering, illicit financial flows, promotion of domestic resource mobilization. Because for us, we hold that if we really want to, push this country forward in terms of socioeconomic development, we really must look at anti-corruption efforts. So even as much as we talk about, broadening the tax revenue brackets and so on, we really must look at what is the contribution of anti-corruption, recovery of assets to all this in terms of enhancing domestic resource mobilization. So we've really focused on stemming illicit financial flows, and really looking particularly on issues around beneficial ownership transparency, which we find key in curbing IFFs. We have tried to also work at the regional level and have even worked together with the Natural Resource Committee of the East Africa Legislative Assembly, to pass a motion which was adopted by a majority of those in the East Africa Legislative Assembly to seek ways in which the different East African countries can come together to stop illicit financial flows, particularly focusing on the extractive sector. We've particularly also looked at IFFs in the real estate and accounting sectors, looking at the role that these sectors and professionals in this sector play in IFFs. So we have tried to bring the particular professionals in those particular sectors together just to address some of the challenges in regard to IFFs stemming from these sectors. Looking at issues around money laundering in the sector, particularly the real estate sector. We've tried to bring them together in a consortium just to be able to focus on some particular interventions. We have also tried to focus much on asset recovery efforts, and I've seen a question on asset recovery. I hope we'll be able to deal with that in the plenary session. But particularly, we have called for the repatriation of the proceeds of crime and anti-corruption identified to have been stored in offshore accounts. This has also included, filing petitions to the National Assembly because at some point we felt that the repatriation was a bit slow. And when you speak to other countries that we expect Kenya to be able to collaborate with, they say that, your country or your institutions have not taken up our offer, in terms of, mutual partnership and engagements to be able to see how, money that has been stashed or resources that have been stashed abroad can be repatriated back to your country. So we've really tried to focus and see what mechanisms need to be put in place to hasten asset recovery efforts and also ensure a proper use of repatriated assets, because, without proper mechanisms, then there's a real risk that money that is even coming back will be, re-corrupted. So that's also been a key concern for us. We've also tried to develop an e-database to enable journalists, particularly, and even civil society organizations and citizens at large to monitor the status of corruption cases in Kenya. When you go to this database, you can get various trends of corruption, the type of corruption cases that have been dominant in this country, the amounts of money in question, the length of time that has been taken to resolve the particular corruption cases, and the outcome, whether it resulted in a conviction, recovery of assets, fines, or it resulted in acquittals. Many of these actually result in acquittals. So there's actually something that we really need to do to ensure that people who have been responsible for corruption in Kenya are punished. But maybe just a little bit about our own assessment in terms of media and civil society and how we can come together, because for some years now we have tried to go beyond just engaging the media through pressers and press releases, and try to innovate various mechanisms to engage journalists in a more structured and sustained manner through training and mentorship. And we have supported various investigative journalists through mentorship grants, and also try to match them with experienced editors and veteran journalists to serve as their mentors and work with them as they identify, research, write, and review investigative pieces that have then been published in mainstream media and independent media, and also some of our platforms. We have a platform called Action for Transparency, and also Media Tech Hub, which really tries to use a combination of media and technology to empower citizens, journalists in regard to monitoring of public resources, tracking of budgets. We also try to share some of the stories, cases of corruption that have been reported to us, because we have mechanisms through which we receive corruption complaints. And for some of these stories, cases, we share them with journalists so they can be able to actually expose them and highlight them. And some of these have ended up in investigative stories. And I think from our own experiences, running the various platforms for media and creating, information, and with the mentorship and capacity building programs, what I'd say in regards to how civil society and journalists can be able to work together is that we both have a critical role to play in terms of documenting and proving grant corruption. It's often been difficult to prove grant corruption, of course, due to its covert nature, especially regarding financial transactions, which tend to be very complex, whether it's at the national level or global level. Tycoons, corrupt officials, criminal networks are highly organized and very well coordinated in terms of how they profit and evade scrutiny. But on the flip side, we as journalists and civil society have often worked in silos, but I think in the last years, there have been attempts to try and bring us together, come together, so that we can be able to address corruption. And I think this is something that needs to be encouraged, because in an increasingly complex world, those strategic alliances between the anti-corruption actors, media, are really vital to meaningfully fight back, against this global scourge of corruption. Tackling corruption means that we need to be able to expose the perpetrators, the professional enablers, and the loopholes that facilitate the illicit flow of money, and also we need to fight for key changes in our countries as a result of corruption. We need to push for justice to ensure, that the perpetrators and enablers are punished, and that we recover resources that have been stolen in corruption. But then this means that there has to be very tight collaboration between the various actors. When you look at the scale of money laundering currently in this global web of very complicated global financial systems, together with state capture, increasing exploitation of natural resources through grant corruption. It's only becoming bigger, and therefore it needs a multi-sectoral approach. So increasingly, as TI Kenya, as an advocacy group, we found the need to really package our findings and data from our own research, from our work, and work with journalists and other civil society organizations to be able to campaign for change and engage with law enforcement to demand for justice. So media and civil society share an obligation to expose wrongdoings and injustice in society. And even when you look at some of the work done by people, John Allen is going to speak by African Uncensored. When you look at some collaborative interventions like the Money Trail, the OCCRP, which also has a partnership with TI at the global level, you can see what has come out of their exposure in terms of illicit financial flow, corruption, money laundering, and tax abuse. And I think if we continue to emphasize on these kind of platforms and these partnerships, I think we'll be going towards a good direction. When you look at some of the major international journalistic investigations, the more recent Pandora Papers, Panama Papers, Lax leaks, the West Africa leaks, they've shown that politicians and society at large, they've shown us how we have the potential, as civil society and also as journalists from collaborative journalism to be able to push for policy reforms and advocacy, because we then are able to expose, politicians and other people, the elites and others stealing from the public. And I think from some of these initiatives, you've seen what we've been able to achieve. So I would say that is very, very important to continue to support. And for us as TI, we're really emphasizing on support for investigative journalists. And even similarly, even when you look at some of the work that we have undertaken as civil society organizations, when you look at the in-depth research done by CSOs, both internationally and even at the national level, media advocacy has played a key role in terms of, picking up some of those findings and recommendations and just spotlighting on them to promote transparency and accountability. Because when we work with media, then we're able to reach a wider audience within the shortest time possible. When I look at some of the work we've done under the Bribery Index, the Corruption Perception Index, and media being able to pick up on these findings and recommendations has really helped us to push for policy reforms and even behavior change to some extent. And similarly, when investigative journalists are able to do their work, I'll maybe use the example, for instance, when TI has worked with OCCRP and where I know even John Allen has done some stories, when they've been able to partner with civil society, just sharing some of these stories even ahead of their release, so that civil society is quick on its feet to be able to pick up these investigative pieces and recommendations coming from them at the point where they are released. I think we've had more impact to ensure that these are just not stories that appear for a few days or just 1 week, but then continue particularly going on to influence policy change and reforms and other advocacy efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. You raised a really important point about collaboration between journalists and civil society, or creating these networks amongst them. And as you mentioned, the complexity of this corruption system, the organized crime organizations, there needs to be, I think, the equivalent in the world of media and civil society to be able to tackle that. And I wanted to ask you, in your experience working with this, and as you start building these networks and support journalists and try to pick up on their stories, what do you think are the key challenges that these networks face when trying to detangle these very complex issues? So journalists, as you mentioned, also traditionally worked very independently, and now in this creation of new links and all these high impact stories, what are the main things or the main challenges when trying to make sure a story has the largest impact it can possibly have?
I think a key challenge I've seen is access to information. And it's been quite difficult. And I'm happy John Allen is here. Maybe he can speak from his own experience as well from the media side. But even for us supporting the media in conducting investigative journalism, particularly when it comes to financial transactions, it's always so difficult to get this information from the authorities, despite having in place an access to information law that was enacted in 2016 in Kenya. There are regulations which are still being, I think, developed by the Ombudsman's office. But even with a law in place and even with that right to access information enshrined in our constitution, we still find that you will write letters, you will seek that information from government sources, but it will not be forthcoming. In fact, many times when you look at many stories on corruption, you'll find that it is information that was, there's always this quote. I remember I used to work in the media, and that was many years ago, I think now almost 13 years since I last worked in the media. And there's always this joke that we used to go, this line that we always used to hear, that from sources not, we used to say from sources not ordinarily authorized to reveal that information, to kind of describe, the source that has given you that information that you have used in your story, because the official sources will not give that to you. And if they do, they'll, give it to you under the table. So access to information has always been difficult. Another key problem has been that sometimes the mainstream, particularly for the mainstream media, they won't publish some of these stories. In our case, we've supported a lot of investigative journalists, I think for the last 6 or 5 years. And every single time we have a cohort of journalists, you'll find almost maybe a third of them who are unable to publish their stories in their respective media houses because, they'll be told, oh, this is against our official, policy in terms of the story that is being covered, or this might create challenges in terms of some of their, business, in terms of maybe to expose some of their key advertisers or clients. And also there's a whole question around media ownership in Kenya, because when you look at the media landscape and who owns, media houses in this country, particularly the big media houses, they all have, a connection with, one of the big political honchos in this country. And so you will always find that difficulty, that you spend so much time and resources investigating a story, even sometimes when you've gotten commitment from the gatekeepers, from the editors. But then when it's finally out, when they look at the content, they say, no, we can't publish this. And so we've had to resort to other independent media to publish, and even some of our own platforms to publish some of these stories. I think those are the two main challenges I still find, among others. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. And speaking of the whole media, so we have time to answer all the questions we're getting also at the end. I would like to pass the floor to John Allen so he can share a bit more about his own experience in the field.
Okay, thanks a lot, Maria. It's tough speaking after Sheila and John, because a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said. So I'll try and restrict myself to some of the things that, some of the observations I think that I can add to this conversation, starting with collaboration, right? So, Pandora Papers, Panama Papers have been cited twice in this discussion as important steps or important innovations in the fight against illicit finance, globalized corruption. And I'd agree. I agree that it's important for journalists to be able to collaborate, but from this point of view, and not only are we better able to understand what the nuance is in our own countries, but we're able to understand the nature of global illicit finance as it affects other countries, and are better able then now to tell a larger story about the nature of global illicit finance, or even just the global financial architecture and how that robs people in our own countries of wealth, of opportunities, etc. Here's where I tend to depart a little bit from John. To this extent, I agree that the globalized fight against corruption has failed to a large extent, but I don't think it's failed. It's been a total disaster. It's failed completely. I think that one of the things, or one of the vestiges of the global fight against corruption that we should retain is in enforcement of laws that arrest people who participate in these networks, if only to slow down the fight against corruption. I think behavior change is an important part of how we're going to be able to fight corruption. But why it is that, especially in countries like Kenya, that even a behavior change campaign might not work in the long term if there's no corresponding enforcement is that these people who benefit from systems of corruption in a very big way operate at the highest level. And it's not for a lack of laws, as you've mentioned, it's not for a lack of, of legislation, etc., or institutions to fight corruption. The point here is that if they are allowed to continue, it needs to work in tandem. There has to be both a behavior change as well as continued efforts to fight corruption by arresting these kinds of people, even if it does serve as some sort of example that you just can't get away with this. And this is now the side of the conversation that I agree with. I agree that the biggest impact of corruption is not even in capital flight and in these terms that we use to express corruption. It is right at the bottom of society, in what that capital flight robs people of. And so this is my jump off point as a journalist. I think one of the failures of journalism over time, but this is being amended, is the failure to recognize those connections and those nuances and explain them in very, very simple, specific terms, and help people sort of see their place in that grand design of globalized corruption, of illicit finance, or even just corruption within their neighborhoods and their countries. Because the numbers are so dizzying, and the majority of our population will never, ever get access to that kind of wealth, will never even be able to understand what that kind of wealth looks like, can buy, can enable, then it becomes almost magical, that in terms of the explanations that you're talking about, billions and billions of shillings. So it's that nuance that needs to be applied on a regular basis in the reporting of corruption that I think is going to help change people's perceptions of it, as well as change behavior, because people will be much better enabled to spot and identify the impacts of corruption as and when they happen in their communities, because there'll be certain kinds of symptoms or signals that will have been explained or have been expressed in the media. Returning to some of the things that I've noticed when reporting about corruption. Sheila had mentioned a really important one. Access to information and access to information laws are by design meant to sort of gatekeep what you can and what you can't say. In some ways for good reasons, but most times, at least when I've made access to information requests, you can tell that the point is for you not to know. So you'll have a very progressive access to information law, for instance, that then now denies a journalist access to information on the grounds of national security, and does not go further to explain what national security is. And so for any sort of instance where the government does not want to give access to that kind of information, then they can just say, it's for national security. And that those kinds of blanket excuses or reasons for being able to deny journalists are written into the law. And if you were to, sort of draw back further and look at the nature of global finance, the architecture of global finance was built by people who understand the law, who understand accounting. They are professionals, and these are the same experts that I think Sheila was talking about, being able to expose the role. But the role is intertwined, it's hemmed into the fabric of global finance. So it's very difficult to unpick what is legal and what is illegal. A great example is what happened here with the Pandora Papers investigation. Whereas you can tell that there's something that's off about it, there's nothing really illegal about people who are politically exposed persons, at least here, in the way in which the Kenyattas did, holding their wealth outside the country. We know it's wrong, but wrong isn't illegal. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a situation where we know a little bit more about the wealth of a politician or a businessman, but are no closer to being able to retrieve that wealth, to be able to bring it back, even if we know that the reasons for that wealth being taken out of the country might very well be to hide. That's a difficulty with reporting about corruption, about illicit finance, about kleptocracy, is that you're often not going to get that big bad wolf at the end of the story. You're going to find smoking guns everywhere, but no shooter, no victim. You understand? And that I think plays into the sense of dejection and numbness that John was talking about. If there is no solution, if there is no sort of like logical conclusion to the stories that we report, then audiences are right in asking, then what the hell was all of this for? You understand? And with the information age, there's plenty of other things that people need to or can or should care about that then do have that kind of emotional payoff in the stories that are told. I think that's an important part of understanding why it's a bit of a hard slog to get any traction around illicit finance. I think the last thing that I will say is related to this, and it's in storytelling. It sounds like a fairly simple point to make when it comes to illicit finance, but I think it's actually the most crucial point. And let me give an example here that you may or may not agree with. Over the past weekend, a story trended across the world, the story of the Tinder swindler. But what is the story of the Tinder swindler, essentially, if you were to look at it from a global illicit finance lens? It is a person illegally withdrawing funds from one country to another. It might not be seen in those terms because of how he operated, but essentially that's what it is. A person with a certain level of power, and then if you look at it in terms of corruption, the kind of themes that we usually report about, it's a person with a certain amount of power predating on people who have either a lack of information or victimizing certain people, right? That's the Tinder swindler story is a corruption story. The Tinder swindler story is a story about the nature in which powerful men or people in positions of power predate on essentially the powerless, right? Or people in positions that they can be made powerless. The borrowing of these kinds of storytelling codes by people who come from a world outside of journalism has made it more interesting for people to then start to interact with the subject of corruption, the subject of illicit finance, even just the subject of just regular cheating, in a way that journalists haven't been able to before. That's an important thing to consider, because how many hours in a day do you spend poring over journalism or over really deep or hard access investigative reports? I challenge you to say that I challenge anyone to say that they spend more than maybe 2 hours, 3 hours in a week looking at this kind of content. The regular person, it means that they spend their time looking at other things, getting interested in other subjects, because we are human beings who have other interests. But how are you going to be able to tell these kinds of stories in a way that they affect the culture in which a person lives, or at least I tend to explain it from that point of view? That's where I think interlocutors, new voices in storytelling are really playing important. There's a lady on Twitter, and this will be my final point. There's a lady on Twitter called Esther Kazuma. So Esther does these 1-minute skits where she makes fun of politicians all over the place, mostly South African politicians for some reason, but generally speaking, politicians. And what that has done is that even at a subliminal level, it's allowing, it's enabling young people to interact with the subject of politics in a way that it doesn't seem very frontal, right? So these kinds of approaches and these new interlocutors in storytelling about the world in which we live are crucial, I'd say, in being recruited to the fight against illicit financial flows and so on. Without and I guess it's that kind of, it's the dilemma that we have where if you then use them to be able to say a certain message, you might spoil the source. But it's worth trying to engage with these new kinds of interlocutors, these kinds of people who perhaps from their own areas of expertise. And I'd consider Transparency International as doing that, being an organization that is focused fully on corruption, but is now going into storytelling, as being an interlocutor, an organization that has a specific subset of expertise. Excuse me. Those means in trying to fight against illicit finance, would work better. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, John. In terms of time, I just want to make sure we cover at least a couple of questions from the audience, but I will try to join the topics together. So we got a couple of questions on tax fraud and how it plays on illicit finance, but also in terms of if there are any organizations working on tax modernization projects and all that. Have you seen that in your reporting experience or in your work? And then second, another topic that came up was the idea of anti-corruption organizations when we were speaking about the top-down approach. So if in your experience, what could be done by African countries to get more practically involved in this collaborative counter-fraud, as mentioned in tax fraud, or counter-corruption activities? So trying to join some topics together, and if any of you have some comments.
Yeah, I can just comment on the collaboration, especially with regard to tax fraud, especially as it pertains to corporates that have a presence in multiple jurisdictions. I think it's possible for civil society and media to collaborate, fairly effectively, where you have an entity in Kenya or an entity in another country that is involved, especially this is usually the case in extractive sectors and the like. Tanzania has some really good recent case studies on this of large-scale extractive sector actors who aren't paying much tax, but are able to basically, through a series of accounting tricks, move their profits around into the jurisdictions where they pay the least tax, which is a problem that organizations like Tax Justice Network have been dealing with and focusing on for a long time. And that's the kind of issue that lends itself very easily to major collaboration between civil society organizations, especially those that are in jurisdictions that are favored by these organizations. And I said it's the ones in extractive sectors, security, and also in mainly extractive and security. With regard to tax fraud within countries, one of the signs that one sees is the more creative a tax authority gets. And Kenya is unique in this, in that Kenya has a very sophisticated tax collection system from its citizens. It's a highly sophisticated, well-developed system. 25 at one point, 25% of GDP in Kenya was collected in taxes. Only Botswana was higher than that, and Botswana is a bit special because of its earnings from diamonds. When you see a tax authority in that kind of situation, which is doing well, beginning to adopt special measures, shall I call them, advertising, really reaching out and almost begging people begging for compliance, then that's usually a signal that the economic pressures are such that it is now possible for the corporate sector to rationalize the avoidance of tax, where they feel, and that's usually quite easy, where they feel that the choices between paying my workers and paying this tax that has been imposed, I've got a tax invoice here from the authorities that is of $2 million. If I pay this, it affects my business in this way. That critical point is usually something that is quite easily available from business actors. They will tell you that we are being squeezed too hard, and they rationalize the avoidance of tax, and unfortunately are assisted in building the infrastructure for that by the auditors and legal firms in the service sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for your comments. And I know we are running over time, so I just wanted to ask if any of you had anything else to add. And if not, yeah, please go ahead.
Just a quick one. I'll not add anything on the tax. I think John has been able to articulate that extensively. Maybe there's a question on issues around asset recovery, and just a comment that Kenya seems to be doing better. Yes, when you look at what we're recovering now, and I think it's largely because of some mechanisms and also changes in strategy that the institutions have tried to put in place. But still, when you look at what is being recovered, vis-a-vis what we continue to lose. If in a year, I think our asset recovery agency says that they recovered about 2-point-something billion Kenya shillings, but then that's the same amount that the president says we're losing in a day, and which in my own estimation is even an underrepresentation of what we're losing. We're probably losing more than 2 billion than what the president or Kenyan president said we're losing in a day. When you look at the reports of the Treasury, and also admissions by some officials in Treasury, and also by the Auditor General reports and so on. So there's still much more effort that needs to be done, but I think there's also been efforts to try and look at civil proceedings, trying to put in place for future proceedings at the point where someone is being investigated for corruption. So that has helped in terms of recovering some of these assets. But when you look at, I think Nigeria is doing much better when you look at what they're able to recover in terms of stolen resources to corruption. So I think there are other African countries which are still doing much better, and we're encouraging our Kenyan authorities to still continue to benchmark and learn from others, even as much as they continue to enhance their strategies. But yes, I admit it's better, but still a drop in the ocean compared to what we're losing. There was a question around, cryptocurrencies. There are several questions. I think it's an emerging area of concern for us. That deserves much more attention in terms of research and even regulations. Not much has been done, I have to say, in the country, but they have been described, as being transformative. They offer a safer store of value because they can be printed or seized. But then there are also just concerns about how cryptocurrencies have still been used to funnel money to illegal sources, and some governments have argued that the rise of cryptos could destabilize their financial systems. I think there's much more that really needs to be done in terms of research and regulation, and maybe this is an area where civil society and also as media we need to come together. John Allen, maybe that could be the next big project we want to look at in terms of investigative journalism, because I think there's much more to be done, particularly in terms of exposing this particular area in Africa. Thank you.
Just one point on cryptocurrency and the questions that are being asked around it. I think for me, the even more powerful potential of cryptography isn't even in cryptocurrency as much as it is in blockchain, the technology that underpins cryptocurrency. See, because then you have a much more open ledger that you can use to be able to solve, quite a number of issues. I'll give you an example. We've recently just concluded tallying the number of cases won versus the number of cases lost by the government over the past 10 years. And 70% of the cases lost are cases in which the government illegally seized land, in illegal land seizures and related to the Land and Environment Court. About 7 billion shillings, at least from our count, has been awarded. Right, a simple, or not simple, but a much easier way to be able to resolve the land question is to have an open ledger system in terms of not just land adjudication, but registration of title that makes it open and efficient for everybody to be able to witness. And it's these kinds of things that increase trust in government that I think will be very, very important. Because what government is suffering from as a result, and these governments across the world, and I guess as a result also from illicit finances, is a problem of trust. So if you have a trust protocol that then enables or removes that burden from the government to be the key repository of trust, then that helps, solve a number of issues. So I wouldn't look at it so much from the point of view of currency as much as the technology that underpins cryptocurrency. That's it.
Thanks so much. I think we could go on forever discussing these questions, but I want to thank you so much for your time and starting all these very important discussions ranging from the whole wider picture of corruption and anti-corruption efforts to the details of actually carrying out that work and those investigations and building these networks and how these can have a great impact in everyday lives beyond those big numbers we see being reported. And because of time, I'll just have to wrap up. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks so much to our panelists for their time. There's great discussions. And with that, I just wanted to mention to all of you that if you want to keep following these events, we make sure to follow us at the CFCS, stay in touch with all our publications and all our activities. So you can follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn. You can see all the details there. And if you haven't, please do subscribe to our podcast, The Suspicion Transaction Report, or if you want to catch up with past events in the world of illicit finance, the Financial Crime Insights, where we discuss events like this and keep carrying on these types of discussions. I'm sorry to cut today short like this, but it's been great to have you, and thank you all for joining us today. And with that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Bye, everyone.